find some influx of folks in the next 10 to 15 minutes. So I just want to prepare you for that. So I am absolutely thrilled that we're able to have the opportunity to hear from Krista Case-Bryant today and really be able to tap into her expertise. So to give you some context, and I know that for many of us, you may have had the opportunity to hear previous speakers who have come on campus who specifically spoken about dynamics related to conservative students on liberal arts campuses. Chris Sweeney in particular last year, and then other speakers who have also spoken to this. Part of the reason why this speaks to me very directly is because of conversations that I've had with conservative students who have shared their viewpoints and really talked about their experiences of feeling marginalized on campus. In particular, I had a student who was in my class my first year of teaching at LaSalle. Really a wonderful student, very thoughtful and very respectful, and really could engage in political discourse in meaningful ways that enriched the class. And certainly as a conservative student, a lot of his viewpoints didn't sort of correspond with the majority of the class, but it made such a positive contribution to the learning environment in the class. I felt very lucky to have him. So I actually ran into him in the fall of my second year teaching here, and I asked him about his internship and how things were going, and he actually indicated that he switched majors, which for me was a surprise. And I asked him sort of, what was your reasoning around this? Was everything okay? And he talked about how he felt that his viewpoints and perspectives politically weren't really welcomed or included within the program that he was a part of. And he talked about, in particular, having experiences where he tried to talk about his experiences and felt as if in his conversations, particularly with faculty, there were ways that he was being, in many cases, refuted. And in his presentation of his points, they weren't things that were being offered in an oppositional manner. They were really offered to offer another, they were being put forward to offer another perspective. And so, from that point in time, for me, it was clear that we were doing something that was problematic. And it was something that was incredibly problematic, not only for folks who identify as being politically conservative, but it was also problematic for the broader community because we didn't foster an environment in which everybody's voice could be included, and therefore we really weren't maximizing the potential for learning here at this college. And so I've had numerous conversations since then and partnered with faculty, staff who identify as conservative, as well as many who identify as progressive, and really talked about what are some of the things that we can do to make a conscious effort to really expose all of our students and community members to a range of viewpoints, and really that prioritizes the importance of viewpoint diversity here on campus. And so through doing some research and being able to do some investigation, I was absolutely delighted to come across Krista and her research. So it was interesting because for me, I was hoping that she would be willing to speak to these issues as far as conservative folks feeling marginalized on college campuses, sort of in our society more broadly, and how that plays itself out. But she also covers some other just wonderful subject matter, a lot of very interesting content. So I sort of reached out to her and said, hey, I would love for you to do Plan A, but if not, if you would be willing to do Plan B or Plan C, it would be great too. And I'm thrilled that she was sort of willing to speak to Plan A, if you will, which is again a conversation related to folks on conservative families and conservative students in particular, and their feelings of belonging on college campuses. So Krista Case-Bryant is a veteran journalist with a Christian Science Monitor here in Boston. Her international reporting adventures have taken her to 4 continents and included a 3-year stint as Jerusalem bureau chief for the Monitor. After serving as politics editor during the tumultuous 2016 political campaign, she carved out a new beat as the Monitor's Heartland correspondent. Over the past year, she has traveled to a dozen states, covering politics and related issues from Appalachia to the Rocky Mountains. She has many other accolades that it would take us a long time to share, so she actually preferred a sort of more succinct bio, which sounds fine to me. But I hope that you will join me in welcoming her, Kristen Case Bryant.
Well, hi. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight. And for those of you sitting a little farther back, feel free to come down. We're going to have a bunch of slides, and some of them have tiny writing on them, so the closer you are, the better you'll be able to take advantage of that. I promise I won't hold it against you if you need to leave early, so don't be shy about coming down front. Thank you so much, Jesse, for having me. I really appreciate that this is a campus where you welcome these kind of conversations. And I just want to be clear, as I told Jesse when he called me, I'm not here to advocate for a particular political standpoint. This is just something that's been the focus of a lot of my work in the past year, and it's something I've given a lot of thought to at a time when journalists are sort of trying to figure out where is the line between being a journalist and being an advocate, and holding people accountable but not becoming an activist. And so I'm really grateful for the opportunity to explore that with you, and I'm just curious how many of you here are from well, let's just start somewhere other than Massachusetts. Okay, how about a state that doesn't border one of the coasts? Wow, okay, we got one over here. Where are you from? New York, okay, that's still on the coast. Maybe you're inland more though. Are you in upstate New York? Yeah, okay, well that kind of counts. Yeah, we'll see the heartland. There's like 9 different ways to find the heartland, and some people put upstate New York in there, so yeah, we'll give you that. So looking forward to having a Q&A with you. I'm trying to try not to talk too much, just give you a sense of my work, and we will get to this topic, but I felt it was important to lay some groundwork first so that you know where I'm coming from. This was a story that I spent about 6 months reporting, and I'll give you kind of the key highlights, and then if there is more questions that you have, there's certainly a lot more that I could say about that. So when my husband and I moved to Jerusalem, that was 6 years ago now, I never expected to not know how to use the computer. Let's see. This was working before. Before I had to, let's see. Oh, there we go. Okay. And make sure that. Okay, can you go back one? Okay. So when my husband and I moved to the Middle East 6 years ago for my work for the Christian Science Monitor, I never expected to find myself between an Israeli soldier's gun and the son of a Palestinian militant. But here I was, it was October 2014. It was a beautiful day. We were at the entrance to Zathra, which is a Palestinian town in the West Bank. And my friend Ibrahim is a teacher. He teaches physics at a local university, and we had just spent the day there because I wanted to see more what it's like to be at a Palestinian university for a whole day. So we were driving home, and we actually got in a huge argument because I said something sort of controversial that made one of his colleagues upset, and he was telling me how I just didn't understand the Palestinian viewpoint at all, and that I need to be more sympathetic. And I was saying, well, you have to understand, like, there's all these other viewpoints too, and you don't understand those because you're stuck here in the West Bank. And anyway, so we're in the middle of this big argument. We come around the corner to this entrance to this village, and on the right, in the separate picture, you can see that big red sign, which is at the entrance of every Palestinian village, and it says, it's illegal for Israelis to enter this village. It's a Palestinian area. It's against the law. You might die if you go in here, and various other warnings. So we were sitting there, and while we had been away, the Israeli military had set up a temporary checkpoint there. Normally there was not a checkpoint. I'd never encountered that before. But they pulled up, and the Israeli soldier stopped my car, and he came and stood right here, and his gun's hanging down, like right next to my elbow, and he's like, what are you doing here? And I said, I'm here to drop off my friend, and he said, you can't go in there, they're gonna throw rocks at you. And I said, no, they're not. I'm here every weekend. Like, the worst thing that's ever happened to me is they fed me too much food, and it was so delicious. And finally, he relented and let us go. And as we were driving away, Jesse?
Oh, sorry. I'm getting batteries. I said, let me try to get batteries because I'm guessing we can fix this.
Oh, okay. As we were driving away, Ibrahim looked at me and he said, "We are going to eat you." And he was smiling, his lips were smiling, but his eyes weren't. And I think, you know, the condescending way in which the soldiers spoke about him and his fellow neighbors in that town was really, you know, hard for him to hear. Are we back in business?
No.
No, you're going to be my personal clicker?
Exactly.
Okay. Sorry, this story's taking a little longer. I promise we'll get back to America soon. This is Ibrahim's family. I spent a lot of time with them on the weekends. Looking forward to the next one. That's Ibrahim with his Jeep, which he was not driving that day. But, you know, just being able to see the kind of situation that they lived in changed my view about a lot of things. And when I had first arrived 2 years before that, I had this very sterile sense of what it meant to be objective as a journalist. You know, I'm going to come and I'm going to talk to Israelis, and I'm going to talk to Palestinians, and I'm going to talk to right-wing people, I'm going to talk to left-wing people, and I'll explain exactly how they feel in a perfectly balanced manner, and my readers will have this wonderful, nuanced understanding of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But that was before I met Ibrahim and his friend Iyad. We had these long talks around the campfire, and it was before I met Rabbi Dovid and his wife Hannah, they're Israeli settlers. And it was before they started calling me their daughter, or their sisters, and their daughters. And before they invited me to their weddings, another wedding, and then before the Gaza war in 2014. And through all of these, I became entwined in these two parallel worlds that just rarely ever touched. And so as this was right near the end of our time, and I was reflecting on sort of the lessons that I learned from that, and this idea of, can you be objective as a journalist? And I realized, you know what? I'm not a robot, I'm a human, and all journalists are human, and we can't pretend that we're not human. And when you're human, you have feelings about things, and you have compassion for people, and that's right, and that's good, and that makes you a better journalist. But it's also really important to be fair. And sometimes, if you know, there's certain political issues that are a lot easier, that sort of tug at your heartstrings, and it's a lot easier to understand why, you know, one side feels one way than another side. And sometimes I think about an example of, like, if a mom has a little 2-year-old or something, and she wants to touch the cake in the oven because she's so excited about the cake, and the mom's like, "No, don't touch that." You know, is that mom being mean? Well, the kid might think so, but she realizes, you know, there's danger for the child in doing that, and so she realizes that there needs to be a rule that you don't touch the hot things. And, you know, it might take a couple of years for the kid to realize that. But sometimes that's how I think about, like, liberal and conservative arguments, because I feel like it's so easy to be like, of course we don't want anyone in the United States to feel like not welcome, or to not have food to eat, or to not have health care, or whatever. I mean, those, like, you know, it's so easy to feel compassion in those situations. And so I think conservatives often struggle to make an argument that resonates with people, especially if it goes against what seems like the kind thing to do. And so part of my job is trying to explore that more. And obviously I'm not there to advocate for a conservative viewpoint, or to, like, tell them how to share their policies in a better way, but I'm trying to understand, okay, is there a motive behind this that may not be as readily apparent, that actually is good and is worthy of consideration, and might complement what the liberal side is trying to do in a helpful way. And so that's a lot of what I'm doing in my work. So after those 3 years in Jerusalem, we came back to America. Can I just go like this? Okay. So we came back to America, and I had a year to sort of decompress and get reintegrated into American life as a Neiman Journalism Fellow at Harvard. And we had 22 other journalists from all over the world. And this is Mary Meehan from Kentucky. And I learned so much from her. She was a local reporter there, and I remember we were in a video workshop class, and the teacher was showing a video that the Washington Post had put together about a day in West Virginia where everybody who didn't have health care could come and get free health care for the day. And we watched the video. I didn't really think anything of it. It was interesting to see a place I hadn't been to before, and to learn more about those issues. But Mary, who was from that area, was just like apoplectic about the video, and she's like, how come they pick the people with no teeth? You know, like how, like why? And they're just caricaturing the people who live there, and the way that they approached it was really condescending, and it was like all these things that hadn't occurred to me at all. And I realized how when you're from a place and you see outsiders come in and you see how they're framing the story, it can feel really foreign, and it can feel like the liberal coastal elites are, you know, trying to make you into something that you're not. And so that was really helpful for me. The following year, I started as politics editor, and it was kind of a crazy time to get thrown into the deep end with Trump running an unorthodox campaign, and nobody really knew what was going to happen. And part of what we did was try to do this, we call it the politics of us. The idea that we can't just sit there and point fingers at Washington. We need to look at how we're talking to each other and how we're understanding each other's arguments about things. So we picked, I think, 8 controversial topics, like climate change, illegal immigration, and this, go back one, and guns. And this was a really great example of how to treat an issue that might seem like people just get so stuck in their ruts, you know, and thinking about, like, obviously we need gun control, like we do not want more kids getting killed at school. You know, on the other side you have, no, we need to uphold the Second Amendment, don't you dare touch it. Well, this guy, actually I'm not sure it's him, sorry, I need to like control my hands. Go back to the gun picture. No, I'll use my hand. He was a gun shop owner, huge proponent of the Second Amendment. He lived in New Hampshire, and yet one week he had 3 different people who had bought guns from his store commit suicide. And he realized, I need to do something about this. Like, I do not want my customers going and using their guns that they purchased here in that way. So he became part of this network of advocates who they support the Second Amendment, but they also support using guns in a responsible way, and, you know, addressing mental health issues and preventing suicides, which actually are responsible for way more deaths than mass shootings. And so that was an example of, you know, here's people who support the Second Amendment who look at this guy and say, okay, he knows where I'm coming from. Like, he had a cannon from the Revolutionary War in his barn or something like that, and, you know, a big plaque about honoring the Second Amendment, and, you know, he's like one of them. But on the other hand, you have people who really want to see killing stopped, and they can look at him and say, okay, he wants that too, you know. And it's a way of, like, if not, our goal is never to like tell readers what to think or to say you should agree with this guy or be just like him, but hopefully it's a way that he can be a vehicle for exploring some different arguments about things. So we did that series, and then, as we all know, the election turned out very differently from how many people were expecting. I remember sitting in the newsroom that night, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the morning, and going, oh my gosh, Donald Trump is going to win the presidency. So after that happened, a lot of media organizations sort of went, whoops, we missed that. We did not see that coming. Why did we not see that coming? And so my boss, who was national editor at that time, after a few months, he's like, you know what, I think we really need somebody to go out into that big red swath and bring those values into our coverage more, so that it's not a surprise, like once every 4 years or something. And he said, you know, just like in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, you were shuttling back and forth between these different sides who were living side by side, but not really understanding each other or talking to each other that much. Take that approach, take it into the heartland, and do that there. So we had to decide, what is the heartland? This is Oklahoma. That's sort of quintessential heartland. But if we go to the next slide, you see these are 9 different ways to define the heartland. So I sort of picked the one on the upper right, which is basically like a lot of rural and mostly conservative areas, but spread out, concentrated in the center of the country, but spread out. And the goal is partly to delineate a geographical area, but also those values, different values than maybe what urban liberals in Boston care about, or San Francisco or something. So it's been a lot of like new territory because no one had this job before I did. And a lot of times, like with the college conservative story that I'll be talking about in a little bit, that wasn't a super popular story in our newsroom. So I was kind of like really glad when Jesse was like, I really liked this story, because I'm like, good, because nobody else did. But it was like trying to get more in tune with not only what do people think about the issues that people in Boston care about, but what are the issues that they really care about, and then making sure that we're doing deep dives into that as well. So one thing I'm trying to avoid is I don't know if the Atlantic was saying this facetiously or seriously, but I often feel like the coverage of Trump country is like, ooh, like the gazelles, they're now like jumping over bushes. We didn't know they could do that, It's like, they're not gazelles, they're your fellow citizens, and like, let's just be respectful and thoughtful and curious, and maybe we could even learn something from them. So this is Glenn. He's a farmer in Kansas, and he's holding a little lamb named Wilma. And I visited him in March this year, just after coming back from the Olympics. And he lived in an area that went very strongly for Trump, and yet Trump's tariffs on steel were really hurting farmers like Glenn. And so I think part of what I'm trying to do when I go to a place like Glenn's farm is get out of those stereotypes that the Sephardi mentality might have. Like, don't go find, in West Virginia, don't go find the person with the fewest teeth, or like the thickest accent, or, I was in the boardroom meeting in Ohio this spring, and there was one guy in particular who kind of stood out as like almost a caricature of what life is like there, and not very well spoken, not very well dressed, not very well groomed, and he or one of his buddies was like, hey, he made the New York, the front page of the New York Times. And it kind of made me so mad that they would have picked him out of this group of all these other men who were a lot better spoken and better dressed and more articulate, and had been working there longer. I think it was at a welding company. And I feel like, as a journalist, you're there to make headlines. So it is sometimes tempting to like find the most extreme example of something, but I also feel like there's sort of a lack of dignity or respect in taking that approach. So I'm looking for stories of like, okay, so what's some of the creative thinking that's going on in these places? What are some of the problem-solving approaches? How are people being innovative? How are they coming together as communities and as neighbors? Maybe even loving their neighbors and overcoming some of those partisan divides that are affecting us here. So Glenn, just one more thing about Glenn and Wilma. 3 days after I left, Wilma passed on in the middle of the night. And I don't know why, but of everybody that I've met in all my travels, like this picture is what sticks in my mind the most about the Heartland. And here's someone who's like working with his hands, rough work, cold weather, and having to deal with the death of these precious animals that he's taking care of. And those lambs are actually part of his sort of entrepreneurial approach to survive in a harder industry of farming, because there's a really good market for lamb meat. So that's how he subsidizes all of the losses incurred by other aspects of farming, including now Trump's steel tariffs. Okay, these are other farmers in Michigan. They're prize-winning fruit farmers, and they too have had to be creative because of immigration policy. And while they live in an area that's heavily in support of Trump, his policies are negatively impacting them as well. They had so few workers last year that they had to leave like $300,000 worth of crops to rot in their fields because they literally could not find anybody who wanted to work with them, and they had a job ad posted all season, and they just only had about a third as many people as they needed. These are some of their workers that they were able to bring up from Mexico this year, but that's a program that may be capped. And I think when people think of Trump supporters, they have a certain connotation of what that means, and what I've found, and I meant to say at the beginning, I had to pick one word for the title of this talk, so we said conservatives, but I think the group of people that I cover is not just conservatives, they're also people who maybe were Democrats but supported Trump, or are blue-collar workers, or poor white people who are on welfare, or, a whole big diverse group, and part of what I'm trying to do is bring out all those different perspectives. Okay, we'll try to scoot forward to the colleges. This is West Virginia, and I think one of the challenges, and this gets to sort of the broader point about conservatives and those other groups feeling marginalized. When you go to a place like this, it's a small town in West Virginia where they had 29 miners killed in an accident in 2010. And the man who was in charge of the company, the mining company at that time, was running for the Senate, and I was doing a story about him. So I come to this town, I don't know anybody, I get a sandwich, I said, where do people hang out here? And the lady said, go to the local auto garage. And so I walk up and I say, hi, I'm Krista, I'm a journalist from Boston. It's like worst opening line ever in West Virginia. They're like, totally didn't want to talk to me. And so it took me a long time to warm up to them. And I think, the more time I spend there, the more I understand why, because they feel like they're just sort of caricatured or maligned in the media, and they become very reticent to share their thoughts. They don't know who you are, what your agenda is. Are you there to make them all look ignorant and like, oh, of course, this is why they supported Trump, And so it took me a really long time to get them to warm up, but I just hung out with them on the porch of the auto body shop, and this guy's like, after 5 minutes, he's like, are you with the FBI? I'm like, no, I'm a journalist. Oh, okay, 5 more minutes. Are you with the DEA? Like, he kept thinking I was from the government, and the funny thing was that at the end of this whole talk, it turned out he's with the government. He was with the Department of Labor, and he was the mayor of this town, and he hadn't given a single interview to anybody since that mining accident happened. And for some reason, he was willing to talk to me, and I don't know exactly why that is, but I think part of it is people just want to be respected and feel like they can share their view and not like have you shut them down or make fun of it or skew it in some way. And the whole issue with like partisan divides on campus, I think, is just a microcosm of what's happening in the broader United States, and that's part of why I'm giving this long wind-up, because I think it's just kind of like a more concentrated example of the problem that I see everywhere that I go. And I think just being respectful and just being willing to hear, and that's something that I have to do. Like, I am, as a journalist, not supposed to express my own political views to the extent that I have my own political views, because it's just not my job. Like, I'm there to understand how other people think about things, and that, whether it was talking to Ibrahim or talking to our rabbi settler friend or talking to these folks in West Virginia, it's really freeing in a way. I recommend it, like try talking with someone you don't know very well and asking what their viewpoints are and trying to learn more where they're coming from without saying, yeah, but, like just let yourself take your own views out of the conversation and just listen to them, and you might get a lot farther than you think. Okay. This was a town in West Virginia where they cut the opioid overdose rate in half, which was a great success story. This was a guy who got addicted to opioids and put in jail for felonious assault his wife, and was rebuilding his life. This is at the place where the guy was on the cover of the New York Times. But Mike here had been able to get back on his feet thanks to a local program that was just amazing. And there are programs like that all over, you know, and I think being able to find those sorts of things and highlight them instead of just like, oh, here's everybody who's down and out and that's why they voted for Trump because they're bitter, you know. Well, no, there are people who voted for Trump who actually like are building companies and giving people jobs and have other reasons for voting for him. Okay, Judge Polster is overseeing hundreds of cases against opioid manufacturers and really trying to find a great middle ground I shouldn't say great because now I'm taking sides, but he's very creative in how he's trying to solve this problem and just get everybody to move forward. This is Amy McGrath, who I just saw in Kentucky, and she told this wonderful story, and it's stories like this that give me hope for our country and for our campuses. She was in the Marines, and she was the first woman to fly into combat, not as a pilot initially, but as the lady basically throwing the bombs down, for lack of a technical term. And she told me about this guy she knew who was called Sugar Bear, and they were in Afghanistan together fighting the Taliban. And one day he was a Republican, she's Democrat, and they would have these like really intense political discussions. And yet she said, I always knew, like never doubted that we just love our country and that we were patriots first and foremost, and that we were there because we're on the same side, we're fighting for our country. And one day he went out and got shot down and never came back. He was killed in Afghanistan. And she decided to come back to this country and run for office because what she heard from President Trump in 2016 was just nothing like what she heard from Sugar Bear. She didn't hear somebody who was putting the country first or putting patriotism first. And I think she's a really great example of someone who has strong partisan views but is happy to engage with the other side and to say we can meet first and foremost on loving our country. This was a guy running for governor at age 17, another guy running for governor at age 17 in Kansas, and now we get to the college aspect of this. Bryant Miller here is also from Kansas, and he was looking, like a lot of conservative families that I talked to, with students and families, really wanted higher education, but was very concerned about going to a traditional institution of higher learning. And the reasons for that vary. Some of them had to do with people coming from religious backgrounds and having sort of cultural or moral concerns about the atmosphere on campus. Others, particularly among the parents, were worried about how liberal ideas would infuse certain topics like sociology or history, and after 18 years of raising their kids in a certain way, they didn't want them to like go away and be brainwashed. And I think there was a feeling among a lot of people that I talked to that just as in the larger political discussion, it's very hard to have in-depth, nuanced arguments about things. That was even more true on college campuses where there's so much concern about not offending each other and making sure that everybody feels comfortable, and that it was like kind of muting the ability to have a rigorous discussion about the most important things in our society today. So what do you do if you're somebody like Bryant Miller? That was sort of what I wanted to know. Do you just sequester yourself in a place where everybody thinks like you? Do you not go to college? Do you, maybe you get into Harvard, but you decide you don't want to be at an elite school, so you go to like a lesser known liberal arts school for people from your church? What are your options? And there were, just for some like statistical data and not just anecdotal, I found some of these very interesting. So can you guys read them in the back? Okay. So the blue line shows the increase in the number of professors who self-identify as liberal, going back to 1990. And you can see there's a pretty significant trend to the right there. The next one shows the gap between how liberal the professors are and how liberal the students are. So that's come down a little bit in the past couple of years, but overall, again, there's a general upward trend since 1990, which means a higher likelihood that a student's going to be sitting in class and feel like not sure my professor is going to welcome my viewpoint if I share this. And the last one, and I have to say, I'm not a social scientist, I'm not a statistician, and I know that you can pretty much make data say whatever you want, but, and I don't know all the ins and outs of how they came up with these numbers. This is from the Heterodox Academy, which promotes more rigorous sort of bipartisan discussion on campus. But I thought this was really interesting because so much of the diversity conversation has to do with ethnicity. And they showed the percentage of under or over representation among US faculty relative to the general population. So on the left you have Asians and Pacific Islanders are much more represented among faculty members than the general population. And then liberals, non-Hispanic whites, men, and then in the underrepresentation, women, blacks, conservatives, and Hispanics. Now again, I don't know how they did this. I can't verify it myself. You can go look at it, the Heterodox Academy. I can send Jesse the links if you want to check it out. But I thought that was a really interesting data point. So what do you do if you're a conservative and you're concerned about these things? Well, I found 3 really interesting examples of conservative thought leaders who are trying to introduce new models. So this one is here in Boston. Finney Kuruvia has 2 degrees from Harvard, PhD and MD, and he spent, I think, 7 or 8 years living in the undergrad dorms there. And I don't know exactly what his viewpoint was going in. I know he was raised evangelical, but over those 7 or 8 years, he lived in the dorms as like an RA or whatever, and just saw all sorts of crazy behavior. Like they had this huge, they call it the Mather ladder, where everybody gets like soap suds and fills the whole dining room with soap suds, and like basically no one's wearing any clothes. And he's just like, I can't believe you're coming here and spending like $100,000 to like get in the bathtub, basically, and like, you know, what are you learning about character education? You know, why are you taking like esoteric classes like Japanese cooking when you don't even know like the fundamentals of, you know, constitutional principles? Something is off here. So he did a lot of thinking while he was at Harvard and decided to found his own college called Sattler College, right in the middle of Boston. Very conservative religious school. You have to learn biblical Greek and Hebrew to graduate. And it's a pretty revolutionary model, but he's starting small and he's making it affordable, and he feels like there's a real yearning for this among conservative families. And this is his first year, so I'll be interested to hear how it goes, but I liked how innovative he was about it. I don't have pictures of the other people that I talked to, but one had a K through 14 school in Houston, and he's part of something called the Classical Christian Movement. So there's been a huge spike in the number of parents who are taking their kids out of public school and putting them in these classical Christian schools. And part of that is like, just kind of, there's something, have you guys heard of the book called The Benedict Option? Has anyone read that? It's about how, like, okay, Christians out there in America, like, you lost the culture wars, gay marriage is here to stay, like, abortion is here to stay, you know, all these things. So stop trying to fight those battles, and if you want to just preserve your way of life, you need to sort of retract and form your own little sort of monastic communities. And the classical Christian schooling movement, for some people, fulfills that desire. So this guy is basically trying to extend that into the college years so that, you know, you don't have to interact basically with people at liberal higher education institutions. And the third one was at the Arizona State University, and they basically made this special center on campus to explore more conservative ideas. But it was founded in part by funded in part by the Koch brothers, who were big supporters of Republican politics in the United States. And so a lot of people in academia were just up in arms about that. Like, you know, this isn't a marketplace, you can't buy our students' minds, you know. So there's some interesting models and some interesting discussions. I'm sure you're probably also aware of, you know, a number of campuses where people have had very rowdy protests when certain conservative speakers have come to speak. It may have happened with liberal speakers too, I'm just not aware of that. But anyway, I don't want to go on any longer. I'm sure you guys are all very thoughtful students and have your own questions, and I thought we could just segue into questions about this college issue or anything else that you want to ask about. before you step down, just go one more thing. If you're interested in exploring more of these ideas, the Monitor covers these sorts of issues all the time. We have a great student subscription rate. It's only $4 a month. That's like for the price of 1 cup of coffee, you get super educated. So it's a pretty good deal, and the first month's completely free. And there's my email address if you want to follow up with questions that you don't want to ask in person, in public. Yes, in the front row. I'm sorry, Jesse's supposed to be running this part of the show.
Do you find that a lot of conservative students are experiencing problems with their professors, like in the classroom?
Yeah, so for example, one girl I talked to at the University of Wisconsin, she actually is the only Republican in her family, so she's like very used to having, robust debates at home. But she was telling me about how in her Spanish class, what was the issue? I think they were talking about abortion, like in some Spanish literature. Maybe they're reading Spanish news items. I don't remember the setting exactly, but she said something, and the teacher was like, "That is absolutely not an acceptable part of, we're just not going to include that part of the spectrum in our conversations here in the class." And she was worried that basically if she said anything more like that, the teacher would drop her grade. And a number of other people who were standing around when I was talking to her were like, "Yeah, I totally had that experience too." Also another student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison had a rock thrown through their window because they had a Trump Pence sticker on their window. I don't know if that's why they threw the rock, but it seemed likely. And another girl who was I think she was in a musical theater program at a Texas school, had like a WhatsApp group or something like that with all her fellow students. And after Trump was elected, somebody chatted on the group, like, "I'm going to kill anybody who voted for Trump." And she had voted for Trump, and she'd always been very quiet about her politics. I think she probably knew she was in the minority, but after that happened, and just with the atmosphere in the country, she actually felt like she was in physical danger. I don't know that she actually thought they were going to kill her, but the level of emotion was so high that she really felt like she couldn't even interact with people. So she actually ended up changing majors, which isn't the end of the world. She didn't get, I don't want to over exaggerate the issues, because I think at a time when you have, someone busting into a Jewish synagogue and killing lots of people, just feeling like, well, maybe you have to study English instead of musical theater. It's not the end of the world, but those are some of the things that I heard. Does that answer your question? Okay.
I just had a question about the things that you just said. Would you consider the rock thrown through the window and acts like that hate crimes against these students?
Oh gosh, I don't know what the actual definition of a hate crime is.
I just find it interesting how a lot of the times people will look at what they view as the minority as people taking all this flack, but they won't really take into account that everyone has not really an equal share of it, but it can happen anywhere.
So, do you think it's a hate crime?
I personally do. I had definitely different views before I came here, and kind of just opened up my mind to putting myself in their shoes and trying to experience it from their thoughts, not with my opinions.
Well, thank you for your open-mindedness. We could explore that. I think this one has been waiting.
So I came here because in my bubble, there's a perception that there are conservatives are powerful white men and the people they've tricked into supporting them. And I was hoping you could add some nuance to that. I have examples, but I don't have any kind of understanding.
You mean, are there any conservatives who aren't powerful white men or deluded supporters?
I think there must be, but
Yeah, definitely. There's so many people that I talk to. I can't verify that they're not deluded, but one of the most, I think from the category of people that you're talking about, one of the arguments that I heard the strongest, even before Kavanaugh was put forward, was the Supreme Court, and people who just were so not happy about voting for Trump, did not approve of him as an individual, didn't approve of his character, didn't approve of his sense of manhood or success or decorum or any of that, but just felt, the Supreme Court, the appointment of Supreme Court judges has a far more lasting effect than even a president's, election. I mean, maybe Trump is only going to be here for 4 years, but someone appointed to the Supreme Court could have influence on our laws for 25 years or more. And so they just really held their nose to vote in favor of somebody who they thought would be more likely to appoint the kind of Supreme Court justice they felt was needed to. And I think there's also a sense that conservatives value the Constitution more, like for its original intent, and not just like, oh, so therefore 250 years later, here's what it really means in 21st century America. I think there's a sense that there's a fidelity to the Constitution, or at least an expression of wanting to be faithful to it, and that means a lot to people, even if they despise the character of the person running for Republican office, or as a Republican for elected office. So I would say that's one of the strongest arguments that I've heard, but also you meet these like incredibly lovely women who are very polite and dear and warm, and I guess you could say they're just deluded, but I mean, they're also smart women. My colleague always talks about this country club she went to, I think it was in North Carolina, leading up to the election, and it was very hard to get people to talk to her because it was like for local Republican women. I think they were very skeptical about how the media would cover them. But she had some really lovely, interesting conversations, and that was actually one of the stories we did leading up to the election that made me think, what, I think some people are getting this wrong. Like, I think there's more support for Trump than you would think by looking at yard signs or by looking at the headlines, So I think they're definitely out there, and I try to find them. So you're welcome to follow more of our stories, and hopefully that'll answer your question better.